Welcome back. We are joined today by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a combat veteran, author, and a former senior advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. A lot of things are happening now with the war in Ukraine. That is, Trump is pushing this new peace plan, and much of the position seems to come from Europe, and a lot of the arguments behind the position is that security essentially requires as much deterrence to Ukraine as possible. I wanted to ask you first, though, if you think there's too much focus on deterrence in terms of restoring security in Europe, because, after all, before the NATO countries toppled the government in Ukraine in 2014 and began their incursion, there was not really any threat to Ukraine from Russia. But of course, deterrence is an important component. But do you think it's being overplayed here?
I think the discussion is ridiculous. I think the empire of lies that has been constructed over the last 3.5 years by the West to try and justify this pointless, destructive war against Russia at the expense of Ukraine and its people is beginning to crumble. And I think it's going to begin crumbling faster and faster with each passing week in the near future, because the situation in Ukraine has reached a point where even the most skillful liar in Washington, London, Paris, or Berlin cannot conceal reality from the public. The Ukrainian military is falling apart. It's disintegrating. Senior officers are surrendering along with thousands of their men. There is now, I'm told, open discussion about turning on Kiev and Ukrainian troops actually moving on the city to rid themselves of Zelensky and his corrupt government. So I'm not sure that any of the fanciful ideas about achieving peace through some sort of agreement that Washington hammers out and eventually gets the support of the Europeans for is any longer realistic or even relevant. I think events are outpacing the West's ability to keep up with them. So at this point, I always go back to the obvious and most intelligent solution from the very beginning, which was the Austrian State Treaty. The Austrian State Treaty was not worried about deterring anything. The Austrian State Treaty was a solemn obligation to divorce itself from NATO, to prevent any foreign forces from establishing themselves on Austrian territory, and maintaining a force that was required for Austria's security and internal stability and not much more. That worked out very well. And I don't think the Soviets subsequently had any interest in going back into Austria. And frankly, I think at some point we'll go back and revisit the situation or conditions in the 50s, and people may rethink a lot of the decisions were made at that point that might have rescued Germany from being split for all those decades. I mean, we just don't know. I'm sure at some point we'll get a look at what's in the archives in Moscow, and we'll probably learn more about what was said here. But my point is, this war in Ukraine is ending. Things are crumbling. The whole fabric of deceit, which is deeply embedded in the West, is going out of existence. All of the politicians that have been handsomely rewarded financially for maintaining the fiction that there was a war being fought in Ukraine against an aggressive, dangerous Russia is vanishing, because Russia has no interest in war with us, never did. The real question is going to be, what are America's interests? At some point, we have to answer that question. We've acted as though our interests are whatever we say this week. But I think what's going to happen in answer to your larger question is that people are going to say, wait a minute, we have one interest right now in Central East Europe. That interest is preeminently to restore good relations with Moscow. Because if you cannot build a better relationship with Moscow, then I think you're going to have difficulty maintaining security in Europe. I think that's the real realization that's dawning, and I think eventually the Alternative für Deutschland will come to power in Berlin, and they understand that. And they want to get out of this sort of tar pit, which we find ourselves in as a result of lying ourselves into this war. So that's it.
Well, it seems that Washington's trying to adjust to these new realities, though, by distancing itself from the war. And well, we all know the rhetoric of Trump that this is not his war. But in Europe, though, we seem to be heading the other direction. That is the rhetoric, instead of being scaled down and preparing for some post-war settlement. Uh, we appear to be going from the rhetoric of helping Ukraine to the rhetoric now of a direct war. Now, I would say we're already, to some extent, fighting a direct war, that we move past proxy war. But the rhetoric from Germany is that we should that Russia is preparing to attack by 2029. In the UK, they have pushed the date forward, saying that there's an existential threat from Russia, but assuming they would have to fight Russia by 2027, while the new army chief in France argued that France should prepare to lose its children in a war with Russia. So kind of a very strong language coming out. No one really clearly defines what a war with Russia would look like, and also exactly what victory would mean against the world's largest nuclear power. But irrespective of this, the war rhetoric is intensifying, though. What do you make of this? Are they preparing their public for war, or is this just a warning to Russia, or do they actually believe the things they're saying?
I don't think that they necessarily believe it, but they're going to say anything that helps them cling to power. And right now, their position in power is falling apart. I think that's the real issue. The globalists that are ruling Europe want desperately to justify their existence and to perpetuate their power. If you admit that the war in Ukraine is lost, that you have no means of changing that outcome, and that ultimately you should focus on the restoration of your own economic productivity and prosperity, you're not going to retain power. You're going to be removed, because the populations in these countries are already concluding they don't want to fight a war with Russia. I mean, this is why when I listen to these ridiculous remarks, I always say, well, what about all of the recruiting stations that have been set up in Oslo, Stockholm, Amsterdam, Berlin, and the tens of thousands of volunteers rushing to join the military for the Great Crusade against Russia? Well, I don't see it. Do you? I don't see any evidence for that showing up. I don't see any appetite for it at all. I think it's all nonsense. When this sinks in, people like Callas, who is running all over the place talking about the war in Ukraine will end when all the Russians leave Ukraine. She's a fool, and she's a laughingstock. It's going to take time for it to sink in, but it's beginning. We're at the beginning of this process, and the Russians don't need to lift a finger. All these governments will be removed. They will go out of business because they cannot sustain themselves on the basis of these lies. Again, it's the empire of lies is crumbling. That's the real success story for the Russians in eastern Ukraine, because the Russians have no interest in marching any further west. Who in their right mind wants to take over anything today in Europe, let alone western Ukraine? It's an enormous burden. There's no advantage to it. There are no great resources to be acquired, and the populations there are troublesome. So why would anybody want to do it? I just don't think that is sunk in completely, but I think it's beginning.
Well, across Europe, we don't have any big recruitment stations sending our youth into this war. But in Germany, you have Chancellor Merz asking Zelensky not to allow young Ukrainian men to escape the country. That is, they belong there either for, to help the economy, or to, of course, send them down into the trenches to kill Russians. But also in other places across the West, you have politicians arguing for either, pressuring Zelensky to lower the conscription age, or even deporting Ukrainians so they can, again, refill the trenches. How do you see, after this war is over, to what extent will you do you think the Ukrainians will, I guess, turn on the Europeans? Because I already saw a recent press release. Oh, no, sorry, there was a tweet from the former press secretary of Zelensky, and she was arguing that, we shouldn't listen to the Europeans. They have no strategy, they don't have no weapons, they have no money, they have no influence. Why are we, continuing to let them, why are we listening to them? And the only thing that comes from Europe now is, continue to fight, to die a little bit more. At best, we can, make Ukraine lose. Make Ukraine lose a little bit slower. But this is not strategy, and also it's starting to seem cruel now that we're reaching the very brutal end of this war.
I think there's a much higher probability in the near future of seeing Polish and German soldiers and police rounding up and forcibly deporting Ukrainians than there is of any war fighting against Russia. I think the Poles and the Germans are both fed up with all these young Ukrainian men that are sustaining themselves at the expense of the Polish and German governments, and they'd like them to go away. They'd like them to go home. So I think that's much more likely in the short term than anything else. Now, there is a concern that certain elements of Ukraine, and I'm talking about small numbers, could launch terrorist attacks in Germany and Poland and France and Great Britain and other countries in retribution for what they feel is their betrayal. I mean, that's not impossible. But that just reinforces the need to deport the Ukrainians. And frankly, if you don't deport these Ukrainians and send them back home when this terrible war finally comes to a conclusion, I don't think Ukraine will survive. It needs manpower. It needs Ukrainians to come back and repopulate that which turns out to be Ukraine. And I don't know what that looks like. But with each passing day, it looks to me as though the map that was devised by Medvedev looks more and more appealing, because it means a large chunk of this thing called Western Ukraine is somehow or another annexed by or confederated with Poland. If that's necessary for the Poles to push the Ukrainians back into Ukraine, I think the Poles would probably agree to that. Because again, all the future events now have to be viewed against the backdrop of two other very important events: the disintegration of the European Union and the disintegration of NATO. Those things are on the table. It was interesting. Earlier today, I was listening to Rubio, the so-called Secretary of State, who doesn't seem to spend much time being Secretary of State, and is also the National Security Advisor and running the National Security Council staff in the White House. And he was insisting that the Europeans were ungrateful and unworthy of our support because they were complaining about the potential use of American military power against Venezuela, but they were happy to see us use Tomahawk missiles and other weapons against the Russians in Ukraine. It's a rather strange juxtaposition, because you're talking about two parts of the empire of lies. The notion that Venezuela in any way threatens us, no. Venezuela is a big drug hub, no. Ukraine is not a vital strategic interest for the United States, never was, never will be. The best that we could hope for in Ukraine was an early end of the conflict and the restoration of some measure of political, economic, and social stability in that country. That was always the interest that we had. The Europeans, and unfortunately people in Washington who were also part of the globalist camp, saw the war in Ukraine as an opportunity to destroy Russia, to harm Putin, just as foolish people in Washington are looking at the opportunity to remove Maduro, as though removing him will solve a problem for us anywhere in Venezuela. It won't. When you begin trying to remove governments, you begin trying to destroy stability and order in any nation, regardless of whether you like it or not, you take enormous risks. And that's what we did in Ukraine, and now we're about to pay the price. And I don't think there's going to be much money left over for anyone. I don't think the Europeans are going to get the hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars from the Russians that they want. They want to steal from the central bank in Brussels. I don't think that's going to work. And I think the sooner Ukraine falls apart, the sooner this war comes to an obvious conclusion, the less likely the Europeans are to take the risks associated with taking the money that belongs to Russia and redistributing it to organized crime in Western Ukraine, which is effectively what you've got right now. Ukraine is an organized crime state. It's not a viable nation state any longer. So I wish people would stop talking about the stupid things and begin asking the question, how do we bring this to a rapid close so that we can begin the process of restoring some measure of order and stability to this place we called Ukraine? Nobody seems to want to go there. And if that's true, then Medvedev's map is the most likely outcome, because the Russians aren't going to wait around for the rest of us to make decisions about what we will or won't support in Ukraine, because they too have an interest in stability in Ukraine. They want an end to this thing. They'd like to get back to some reasonable commercial relationship, not just with Ukraine, but also with Poland, Germany, and the rest of Europe. So they'll move on their own. That's why I think all this discussion right now in the Trump administration is all irrelevant. Because from the beginning, Donald Trump, regardless of what he says, he wants something to happen because he wants to be at the center of it. He's very big into what we refer to loosely as optics. He wants to be the center. He wants to be worshipped. He wants to be glorified as the great man who brought peace. The problem is he's done the opposite. He joined the very people that he condemned and criticized while he was running for president. There's no difference between his administration and Blinken and the rest of these people and what they did under Biden. So right now, what does it all mean? I think, again, with each passing day, the empire of lies crumbles. Eventually, it's all going to come out. It's all going to look bad. And it's going to have an impact at the voting booth, at the ballot box, if not earlier than that in the streets.
Well, again, there's no recruitment. One sees, though, that the Europeans, at least, they are talking about building up the capabilities of fighting Russia. Now, one shouldn't undermine Germany's industrial potential, but how realistic is it, though, for Germany to actually build this army from scratch to fight Russia? Again, both the equipment and the manpower. And
It's absurd. It's unworthy of serious discussion. It takes 10 years to build a military establishment today. That, just look at a whole decade. You've got to look at where we have been over the last 35, 40 years. Look at the military establishment you have, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that most of what we've got and the way we're organized to fight, the structure of warfare, the paradigm of warfare, all of that has changed. Now, who is organized and prepared to fight differently in the future from the way we fought in the past? Quick answer is Russia. Are we? No, we're not. We're a long way from that. It's going to take time. So that's the first thing. Second thing is, when word reached Berlin and Vienna, Austria, in 1815, that Napoleon Bonaparte had landed, had come back from Elba, and was on his way to Paris, there were 140,000 Germans lined up to volunteer to fight in the Prussian army. They could not take all the volunteers that were willing to fight. The Austrians were experiencing something similar, but it was taking them longer. The Austrians have never been as efficient as the Germans. So they were going to raise an army of 300,000. Ultimately, we know what happened, Waterloo and that campaign and so forth, and Bonaparte never had much of a chance of retaining his position, as it turned out anyway. But my point is, what was the difference? Everyone was prepared to volunteer and fight against another French invasion. Why? Because the French had invaded, they'd raped, they'd plundered, they'd pillaged. There was deep-seated animosity and antipathy, not just for the French, but for this man Napoleon that had unleashed hell on Europe for years. That doesn't exist right now in any of the capitals of Europe or in any of the populations. And this Russian army, if nothing else has become clear during this war, despite the lies told about it, this Russian army bears no resemblance to the Soviet armies of the Second World War. They have not behaved like the Soviet armies at all. If anything, they have a closer relationship with Tsarist Russia, which was hardly perfect. But if you look at the Tsar, just if you looked at the Kaiser in Berlin, all of these people were humanitarians compared to the people that followed them. All right. So there's no groundswell of support to go against Russia. And this is going to become increasingly obvious. But you are going to see in Europe a groundswell of support for throwing out the foreigners. Getting the Ukrainians out is one problem. What are you going to do about all the Turks and Arabs and Africans that you've got in your midst that will never assimilate, will never become Europeans, don't want to be Europeans? In fact, they're there to change Europe into something that they want, as opposed to what the Europeans want. These are much more serious. And I continue to urge people, listen to Professor David Betts. If you haven't brought him on your channel, you should bring him on and let him talk to you about the potential for revolutionary change and upheaval in Great Britain. Because you can take many of his observations and you can apply them on the continent. It's not a perfect one-to-one fit, but it deserves attention. That's where the future lies. The future lies in the defense of Western civilization inside Western civilization, not in a war with Russia. That's just nonsense.
But as well, you mentioned that our armies are hardly prepared for a war with Russia. So again, having this direct war doesn't seem like a very good idea. But how do you think NATO will be reshaped after this war? Because there's two kind of hypotheses. One would be that will we now we woken up, we're gonna rebuild NATO and make Europe powerful again, or do you think NATO's gonna start to fall apart after this war is over?
Oh, I think it's already begun falling apart. It'll just become official in the months ahead. It's not something where all of a sudden we wake up one morning and the whole place collapses. It'll be a slow crumbling. But at some point, the buildings in Brussels, the buildings in Mons will be empty, simply empty. And the Europeans will realize, as I've said on more than one occasion, and I believe this very truthfully, exactly what Charles de Gaulle said. Americans do not live in Europe. Great Britain is an island. So where does that leave Europe? That leaves Europe to the Europeans. And the other problem that has always afflicted NATO, I shouldn't say always, but certainly for most of its life, is that the strategic view from Madrid or Rome is different from the strategic view from Berlin or Helsinki that is now part of NATO. In other words, the threats that are viewed and taken seriously in one area of Europe are not the same in other areas of Europe. What this really suggests that instead of having to herd all of these European states into one little or one large conglomerate, I think you will see regional security alliances emerge where there is truly a commonality of interest. It will be strategic commonality, cultural commonality, racial commonality, even religious commonality, because we know from history that race, religion, language, and culture, they overlap. They always have. It's not a perfect fit, never has been, but they overlap. So it's much easier for someone in Berlin to understand the perspective of someone in Stockholm than it is for someone in Portugal, in Lisbon, to understand the perspective of people in Vienna, Austria. These are just facts. So something else will emerge, and it needs to emerge at the insistence of or on the initiative of Europeans. Remember, Eisenhower said when we signed on for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, he said, if this exists in 10 years, we have failed. Because he saw the mission of the United States to promote productivity, prosperity, and peace. And he saw that as inevitably leading to our removal from Europe. Only we decided we enjoyed staying there. We saw Europe as part of our empire. In other words, we were like the Romans who looked at Greece and recognized that the Greek city-states were the foundation for our civilization, our way of life. That's the way the Romans viewed it, and they saw it those terms. Ultimately, the Greeks asked for their help to throw the Macedonian barbarians out of their country, and ultimately the Romans stayed because they said, we're here, we're not going back, you need to behave, stop fighting with each other, and become part of the Roman Empire. And so for the next 500 years, that's what they became, part of the Roman Empire. Well, today, we're a little more modern in our thinking and understanding of the world. There is nothing that we can do to rescue Europe in a total war with Russia other than to help destroy Europe. And I would argue that's been true since the 70s because we never fielded the conventional military power that would limit the war with the Soviet Union to a purely conventional level. So at some point in every game, war game, exercise, there was a nuclear exchange. And you know what happened as a result of that? The war games ended because everybody understood, look, we just nuked Moscow. Moscow's nuking us. It's over. Look, we got to get out of this. There's no future in that. The Russians don't want it. We don't want it. The Europeans don't want it. I'm talking about the European people. They want to live in a peaceful, orderly environment. They want to be able to have their countries and live in those countries as they would prefer. They're not interested in being dictated to by von der Leyen or anybody else in Brussels. They don't want it. And they shouldn't have to put up with it. But they do need security. And each man's view of security is going to be a little different. And so I think you end up with regional organizational constructs that fit the needs of the people in a particular region. I mean, if you go back far enough in European history, go back to 1866, and that's why Bismarck fought against the dismemberment of Austria-Hungary. He said there's no better solution right now to the problems of the peoples that live in Central East Europe than the Habsburg Empire. He said, so we may not like it, but it's better than the alternative, which could be chaos. Well, I think you're going to have a similar conclusion emerge somewhere along the line among Europeans. What are we going to do instead of NATO? Now, the other thing to keep in mind is there's no one with any foresight or vision in Washington at all. So just write it off. There's no one who thinks in terms of what the future could look like and where we might fit in. Americans can always support and assist the Europeans in devising a different future, but we should not lead it. So if you were really interested, at least temporarily, suspending the dissolution of NATO, what should happen in Washington is very simply, President Trump should say, we need a European in charge militarily, and we need a European in charge as the Secretary General. We are going to back out of those roles. That doesn't mean we're leaving 100%, but it means that we should not lead you into the future. Europe must find its own future. And that includes something other than NATO, a different kind of security relationship. But I don't see anybody in Washington thinking about that. Washington is a reactionary Austria in the 1840s, clinging to its empire, trying to beat down any opposition to change. That's what Washington is. Washington is not Prussia, and it's not Prussia-Germany. It is not the cohesive, stable state that Prussia-Germany was. We're more like Austria-Hungary now. We are a collection of minorities, and all of them are screaming for power, control, and influence. We're trying to manage that, which is about all that we can do at this point. But instead of coming to terms with what we should do at home, we are out smashing anything and anyone, anywhere, who seems to challenge our dominance, our hegemony. That's the problem. I mean, the whole fight right now, financially and economically in the world, is to preserve the dollar-based system. All the billionaires that surround Donald Trump right now and are dominating our political life, they have become billionaires as a result of this financial system that emerged after the Second War. Only we've moved from a productive capitalist model to a highly financialized capitalist model where nobody produces anything. We just move funds around and people collect transaction fees. That's how the billionaires became billionaires. And they're in charge. Now they're going to ride this horse until it drops, unless somebody steps in and says, you got to get out of here. We need Americans in Washington concerned about the survival of the United States and the American people, whatever that is now. We're not hearing much about that. Congress doesn't care. Everybody is out there trying to make money, trying to enrich themselves. That's why you see Marjorie Taylor Greene and others now talking openly about just leaving, because they see there's no hope. Everything is bought up. Everything's about self-enrichment. That's not a government. That's a going concern. That's a corporative entity that is sucking the life out of the United States. So I guess what I'm trying to tell Europeans, and I know a lot of Europeans listen to your program, is we're not able right now to step up and offer anything that's rational. That's the problem.
My last question is on where do you see the United States going as a result of this? Because after the defeat in Afghanistan, people were pointing out, it's harmful for credibility, all of this and that. But again, this could have been written off as a misstep, a very long, powerful misstep, though. But it's still of a hegemon. It's not as if the hegemon wasn't still there. But NATO's defeat in Ukraine is much more significant, though, because the whole NATO, post-Cold War NATO, that is NATO expansion to pursue collective hegemony, that is to gradually push Russia out of Europe, managing Russia's decline, forcing Russia to adjust to increasingly worse new realities for itself. This was the unipolar order, though. This was the NATO objective. It was the manifestation of unipolarity. This is Europe without one country, which happened to be the largest one in Europe. But now that NATO has been defeated in Ukraine, how do you think the Americans would react? Because I know the Europeans, they're hoping that we will. It seems like they're realizing that the post-Cold War order is over, that Russia has reasserted itself. But I think they would hope that we kind of revert back to the Cold War period of very powerful containment of Russia. However, Russia is not the main opponent. Indeed, some would argue why it has to be an opponent at all. But the idea that we would go back to this Cold War mode where the Americans would anchor themselves and in Europe and spend all these resources, they had it after World War II, not so much now, and also they have other priorities. So what does this mean for United States? How will it view NATO? Not just Trump, because he's a different political animal, but where do you see the trends in America going?
Well, I think there are two answers to your question. You have to distinguish Americans from the elite class of globalists that currently rules us. Okay, so let's talk about Americans. Most Americans on any given day, if you walked up to them in Kansas City or Seattle, Washington, or Des Moines, Iowa, and you said, what do you think about NATO? And the average American would say, what's that? They're not engaged. Well, we have troops in Europe. Yeah, I know. And why are we in Europe? Well, it's 80 years since the Second World War, and we're still trying to keep the evil Russians from invading. The average American will look at you, what? What are we doing there? I guess what I'm trying to get across is that the average American citizen is preeminently focused on what happens inside America. That's the great frustration now, not just with Donald Trump, but with Washington in general. People are saying, wait a minute, 70% of Americans are scraping by. They're living paycheck to paycheck. What are you doing about that? We listen to everybody say, well, we're bringing back jobs and industry. We're going to restore productivity. Okay, what have you done? Then the president steps up and says, well, I'm going to allow Saudi Arabia to bring in its own workers to establish, a corporate entity on American soil. But they don't want any American workers, so we're going to let them have H-1B visas. In other words, we're doing exactly the opposite of what Trump said he was going to do. Americans feel increasingly betrayed. It's not just Democrats, it's not just Republicans, it's the whole group. And increasingly, people are listening to Democrats and Republicans and saying, doesn't matter what we do, we end up with the same outcome. There's just not that much difference anymore, despite what they may claim. So that's one part of the answer. The other answer, I think, is look at what the elites are saying. This man, Witkoff, and I guess Kushner as his partner, neither of these men have been appointed officially to any position at all. I don't even know if they have clearances or they're even able to get clearances. And they're running around negotiating on behalf of President Trump, representing the American people and the United States government. Really? It doesn't make any sense. In other words, why have a cabinet? Why have the facade of a government if you're going to run this operation as though it's an extension of your family and your friends, the people that you've done business with, who ostensibly have rescued you historically from bankruptcy? Has it always been this way? No, not really. We've had tastes of it before. We've had short periods where this kind of thing obtained, but this is something that's very, very different. And then you have Witkoff advising the Russians, according to this latest transcript, which is circulating, about his discussions with Peskov in Moscow. This is how you cultivate Donald Trump. This is how you persuade him that he should do something, by telling him how great he is and that he is a wonderful leader and he's bringing peace and happiness and everything. I can hear the laughter from the Kremlin all the way here, and I'm outside of Washington, D.C. This is absurd. This doesn't make any sense. And then you listen to people on the Hill that are angry and say, well, if he's representing America, helping Putin come to an agreement with us is treason. Well, I'm not sure I would call it treason. It's depressing. But the point is that we've got a lot of very confused people. We have people who have decided that Russia is this permanent enemy of everything good, which we associate ourselves with. In other words, we're good, they're bad. Everything's black and white to people in the Hill. Why is it black and white? Well, my donors see it that way. That's what it comes down to. And the average American, what does the average American know about it? Nothing. George Kennan, when we were involved in Vietnam, tried to make the argument on more than one occasion that we shouldn't be in Southeast Asia and Vietnam because most Americans don't even know where it is. There's a lot of truth in that statement. I've come to the conclusion, if the average American voter cannot identify the place on the map, there's probably no reason for military presence in that area. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do business with everyone. You see, that's the original concept under Washington and the people that founded the country. They wanted to do business with everybody. They were never isolationists. That's a phony term. If you want to do business with everyone, you're not an isolationist. But then, thanks to FDR and the catastrophe of World War II, we were told if you're not everywhere militarily, you're an isolationist. Well, there's a very different formula. And I don't think we've sorted this out. So I guess we're just going to all sit on the sidelines and watch everything disintegrate. And I include Washington in that. This is not just the beginning of the end for NATO and EU. That's been underway for some time. That's going to happen. It's also the disintegration of things in Washington, D.C., because none of it rests on the foundation of rationality or national interest. Do we have a national interest in the destruction of Iran? No. Do we have a national interest in the destruction of Venezuela? No. What are we doing? And Americans, when things get worse economically, when our position financially deteriorates further, these questions are going to come up. And the people that have provided the old lies as answers are going to go under. So I go back to where we started. The empire of lies constructed by Washington and its globalist allies in Western Europe is crumbling. It's not crumbling fast enough for my taste, but it's crumbling.
Well, it seems to be coming to an end this side of the Atlantic as well. That is, the propaganda starts to look more and more ridiculous. We still have political leaders here arguing that, well, the Russians are losing like 5 times more soldiers than the Ukrainians, despite them, surrounding all their cities, dominating drones, artillery. It doesn't make any sense anymore. But I guess, yeah, that's the problem of losing a war, though. They don't get to write the history thereafter, and I think there might actually be some accountability.
Let's hope so.
Anyways, thank you very much. I know you're very busy today, so I appreciate you taking time.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn. Bye-bye.